Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Leela Rhodes and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you so much for joining us here at NetCom Learning, a market leader in promoting lifelong learning, training, and talent development solutions. We are very excited to host today's webinar, Learn the 5 Pillars of CompTIA Advanced Security Practitioner Plus, CASP Plus, and Master the new CASP Plus exam. Presenting today's topic is Dean Pompilio. Dean is a seasoned EC Council certified subject matter expert with over 20 years of experience. He has trained participants for CompTIA, EC Council, ISACA, ISC Squared Microsoft, and VMware certifications, and he has worked as an IC security expert for several large federal agencies, including financial institutions and Fortune 500 companies. He has delivered technical training for diverse participants, including government workers and corporate employees from global organizations. Now, please bear in mind that this is just an overview of a very robust topic. We do offer a collection of technical and business courses that can be tailored towards your specific requirements. If you're interested in a further discussion about any of those, you can make an appointment with our learning consultants through our website at www.netcomlearning.com. Today's session is also being recorded, so you will get free access to the recording in the next 24 hours via email. NetCom Learning helps customers build innovative learning organizations by achieving a smarter workforce, adopting change, and driving growth. We do this with a broad catalog of offerings, developing customized learning plans and our global delivery capabilities. Since 1998, we have been empowering organizations with our managed learning services to help them reach optimal performance results and address challenges. We have 9 practice areas in which we specialize, and they encompass people, process, and technology training. Today's presentation is from the security practice area. NetCom Learning offers a comprehensive training portfolio for security courses, and our upcoming classes include various training on CASP Plus, certification prep, exam CAS 004, CompTIA A+, certification prep, exam 220 to 1002, Network Plus certification prep, exam N10-007, and many more. And our private training to teams is also available, of which the learning plan can be customized to the specific needs of that audience. You can also access a variety of security marketing assets, such as the free 1-hour training, free on-demand training, and blogs by clicking on the available webinar handout. These offerings can also be found with a simple search on our website, www.netcomlearning.com. In this webinar, we will explore and learn about enterprise security operations and architecture concepts, multiple technologies, operating systems, and platforms that will help your team to reach the peak of security performance and much more. Now, I'll just give you a quick overview of the logistics before we do get started today. To start with, you have the option to adjust the window size to your liking. You can simply hit the escape key and find the Zoom button on the top left corner of your GoToWebinar viewer. Everyone has been muted except for our presenters, so feel free to submit any questions you have for the presenter in the questions panel, and we will address them at the end of the session today. Also, to get the best out of today's webinar, we've included the slides, courses we've talked about, and marketing assets in the handout section of the GoToWebinar viewer, and you can refer to those at any time to get a better understanding of today's topic. And now I'm going to go ahead and pass the time over to Dean to present. Dean, you should be able to share your screen now. How are you doing today?
Leela. I'm doing great. It's going to take a few moments for the screen to share. Looks like it's there.
Yep.
So hello, everyone, and welcome to the overview of the CASP exam. This is a pretty challenging course. I actually just taught it last week for a group of about 25 students. And we had a lot of fun going through all the material and just learning all the wide variety of topics that this course covers. So we have a simple agenda. I'll give an overview of the exam itself, and some of the parameters for qualifying to take the exam. And then we have the 4 domains that the exam covers. As you can see those here: security architecture, operations, engineering, cryptography, and then GRC. So a few things here about the exam itself. It's actually a relatively short exam. A lot of the exams that CompTIA offers or other vendors offer have more than 90 questions and a little bit less time. So I went ahead and calculated the length of time that you get for each question. 1.83 minutes is actually pretty good. Most other exams are more in the 1.4 minutes per question range. And you might think this little detail isn't all that important, but it actually is, because when you're studying for a test like this and when you're taking the exam, you have to properly pace yourself to make sure that you're answering the questions quickly enough so that you don't run out of time. That being said, there's a mix of question types. We have multiple choice, typically 4 choices. You pick one of those 4, and everyone knows you have to pick the best answer. Sometimes there might be more than one answer that appears to be correct. That's just the way these types of exams go. We always want the best answer. But the more challenging part of the exam is the performance-based questions. These require the student, or the candidate rather, to manipulate different types of interfaces. You might have to drag and drop some things around the screen. You might have to create firewall rules. You might have to match up terminology with definitions and so on. And I always recommend to people do the multiple choice questions first and then come back for the performance-based ones, because those are going to take a little more time, and it's better to save those for the end, in my opinion. Otherwise, you need 10 years of IT experience, half of that being in IT security. That is a pretty steep requirement, and that's why this is considered an advanced certification. You wouldn't want to attempt this unless you already have that sort of background. And as we can see from the certifications that are being recommended, that's a pretty big list. I would say minimally Network Plus and Security Plus. The other ones, CISA Plus, Cloud Plus, and Pen Test Plus, are also great, but maybe not quite as pertinent to this exam. They're just great because they have a lot of extra knowledge areas that overlap a little bit with this course. Now, you don't have to prove that you've got these certifications. It's not a hard requirement. It's just recommended. And the last item is there is no scaled score. So you find out at the end if you've passed or not. These are how the domains break down. And as you can see, they're somewhat even, except with the exception of GRC being a little bit smaller than the others. And you could approximate how many questions you might see for each of those domains based on the percentage. Now, as far as the exam content, as I was just saying, it is an advanced certification. The expectation is that someone's been around for 10 years, as we know, and you've got the experience and knowledge of being in lots of different roles in different situations. And this is made for practitioners, not necessarily managers. Other certifications are more manager oriented. This is not one of those. This is more for the technical folks. And because technology is changing quickly, there are lots of particular topics that you should be aware of before deciding to prepare for this exam. So let's look at our first module, first domain, which is security architecture. At a high level, we can see some of those areas that you want to focus on. IT services in particular, we've got a lot of different things to think about for a typical IT environment. Load balancers, firewalls, VPNs, gateways, proxies, doing, having knowledge of how to monitor traffic, how to monitor the use of your security controls. You also need to know about network segmentation and why that's important, being able to divide up an environment into different zones. A more modern term is zero trust and deperimeterization. This basically means that there is no point where anybody is trusted for anything. You must prove your right to know or your need to know at every stage. That's a great modern trend in IT security. And so is software-defined networking. We'll talk a little bit more about virtualization in another section as well. Merging networks, trying to look at the overall design, the architecture itself, and trying to think of how does that affect the usability of your IT environment. Another area for security architecture is being able to choose proper design components and design methodologies. Building for growth, for instance, how scalable can you make your environment? Can you produce a high availability solution, which relates to resiliency? Favoring automation is important because humans can only do so much. We need computers to do the work while we sleep, so to speak, as far as monitoring and alerting us when there's problems. You're also expected to know about application containerization, virtualization, not only the concept of what virtualization is, but a little bit about hypervisors and guest operating systems and so on. A few other things we have would be caching and content delivery, which kind of go together. You think about companies like Netflix, for instance. They've got a content delivery network that is global, and they can service their customers better because of that. More topics for security architecture. We have to think about software applications. So whether the organization is designing the software internally or whether it's acquired, there needs to be attention paid to how this is done with security in mind. So choosing a configuration baseline or creating one, trying to provide a consistent basis for configuring systems. There's also software assurance, which is another word for confidence. So can you build the right components and create a secure solution for your organization? Things like DevOps, sandboxing, and so on would be under this area. Then we've got enterprise applications like customer relationship management, content management systems, enterprise resource planning. These are lots of areas that fall into this category. And we can't forget about the SDLC, the Security Development Lifecycle. There's also the System Development Lifecycle and the Software Development Lifecycle that some of you might be familiar with. And we have to think about data security. So application security naturally leads to data security. The data is what we are protecting ultimately. So preventing the loss of data, preventing its misuse, dealing with security labels, classification. And certainly we have to think about impacts on privacy, which we'll see in another section. When to use encryption. What does the life cycle of data actually look like? It gets created, it gets used, it might get shared, it might be archived or destroyed at some point. Those are the kinds of phases we would be thinking about. And of course, you can't forget about the need for keeping data available. High availability solutions lead us to things like backups and restores and recovery technologies. Next, we have cloud and virtualization concepts. And as I was just saying a little bit about virtualization, hypervisors, containers, software-defined networking, these all fall into this category. You need to know what middleware is, converting formats of data from one type of system to another. And naturally, with cloud computing, we have service models and hosting models, things like a software as a service, public clouds, private clouds, platform as a service. You'll need to know all those definitions. Even the virtualization for storage is a part of the content. Public key infrastructure is a big topic. Many organizations use this to have secure badges for their employees so they can securely authenticate themselves to their systems and so on. So you'll learn about the different areas or the different components of a PKI implementation, how to provide integrity, making sure data is correct and not corrupted. Non-repudiation, making sure you can prove someone took an action. And then, of course, having some exposure to use cases, which appears in multiple other areas of the course. But many organizations use PKI, so it's important to know how this works and what its benefits are for the organization. And we have emerging technologies to think about. There's quite a few things here that might be familiar. Quantum computing is probably the most modern concept on this list, maybe followed closely behind by blockchain. But AI, machine learning, and other topics have been around a little longer, so hopefully those are more familiar to folks. Homomorphic encryption is another strange thing. This allows the use of encrypted data without actually decrypting it. It's an interesting concept. 3D printing, augmented reality, and other pretty exciting topics. Some of these are more maybe in the entertainment area as far as augmented reality anyway, but nanotechnology is also really hot these days. And artificial intelligence just in general applies to a lot of these other areas. So it's a pretty exciting time to be alive when we think about these kinds of topics. Moving on, we have security operations. This module talks about a few other things that are more from the day-to-day functioning of the organization. Where do you get your threat intelligence? What kinds of adversaries or attackers are targeting your organization? What do we do about that? How do we build a secure environment that's resilient to various forms of attacks? There's certainly lots of ways to think about that. And knowing what the attackers are targeting helps us understand their motivation. Are they hacktivists? Are they script kiddies? Is it organized crime? Is it a nation state? These are the kinds of topics that we'd expect to cover here. Then we have vulnerability management. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses. We know that these sort of come and go. You're never really free from vulnerabilities, just like you're never really free from risk. So learning how to discover vulnerabilities, how to use the proper tools to give you the details that you need to fix the problem, which includes, of course, patching systems, building them according to baselines, using lots of different tools to discover where the weaknesses are so that those can be remedied in a fast manner. Other things for security operations include the assessment of vulnerabilities and pen testing. So vulnerabilities are just a weakness. It's another word for weakness. How do you find them? What do you do with the information once you've discovered the weakness? There's lots of different areas to think about there. And of course, looking at code that's static, it's not running, but you're studying it anyway, examining running code, doing fuzzing, pivoting, persistence. There's lots of different pieces of terminology here to think about. And as far as the tools, port scanners, vulnerability scanners, interceptors, password cracking, these are all topics that will be discussed in this CASP course. And as far as requirements, we have lots of different things to think about, like asset inventories, policy creation, dealing with the permissions and roles within the organization. These are all areas that are important topics for security operations. Then once vulnerabilities get discovered, you'll have to learn a lot about different vulnerabilities as well. Things like certificate errors and weak encryption or buffer overflows. Poorly chosen third-party tools and libraries. Once these get discovered, how do we match vulnerabilities with attacks? there's a weakness, there's an attack that might exploit the weakness, and that's an important bit of knowledge to have. Some technology is vulnerable because it's a little bit older. Sometimes it's just misconfigured. So we need to understand those concepts. And then, of course, thinking like the attacker is important, because if you're defending against attacks, you need to know what to expect. How does that fit into the overall operations of your organization? So attacks like cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, SQL injection, interception attacks, denial of service, social engineering. These are some examples that you might be aware of. Beyond attacks, we have to think about risk. So if threats exploit vulnerabilities, we've got some risk to think about. So being able to proactively detect the risk is really important. Things like setting up honeypots or honey nets. How do you process the information that you're gaining from monitoring your network? What do you do with all that analytical data? Could it be used to create new security controls or to improve security controls, trying to prevent attacks to begin with? So things like antivirus, using sandboxing, dealing with controlling applications as far as like whitelisting, blacklisting, trying to automate some aspects of security is also pretty important, because humans, we need to sleep sometimes, so we have to have tools that can watch and monitor 24/7, 365. That's the expectation. And then we wrap up that section with physical security. And that's maybe one of the easier topics to understand, because most people have solid exposure to that. We know what locks are for and what lights and cameras are for and so on. And when incidents do occur, you need to know what the proper response should be. So learning about things like false negatives, false positives, true negatives, classifying events helps to understand what to do. And triage would be trying to prioritize the response. You work on the most important things first, and so on. Incident response has a lot of different components to it. You have to prepare, you have to detect, you have to analyze. There's containment and recovery, lessons learned. Those are some of the areas that are part of that topic. Then we have communications plans, playbooks, that are other ways for the organization to become more efficient when dealing with these problems on an ongoing basis, because it never really ends, right? There's always going to be new vulnerabilities that get discovered as time goes on. In the process of investigating, you may have a need for forensic techniques. So how do we gather evidence? What do we do with it once we've got it? How is it gathered properly so it's not corrupted in some way? How do you establish chain of custody, for instance, or the dealing with the most volatile information first? Other things to think about would be making sure the evidence doesn't get corrupted. You'll need to understand some concepts of cryptanalysis. So what is encrypted data? What can we do with it? What can we learn from it? Also, steganalysis. So steganography is a method of embedding information into some other object. And so we'll need to learn a little bit about that as well for the exam. Taking things a little bit further, we want to think about forensic techniques. So how do you extract evidence from a system that's been victimized by a hacker? What sorts of tools are available? Doing things like memory dumps, hex dumps, trying to trace memory usage while a process is running. These are some of the concepts that we think about. And there's several tools, of course. As you're going through this course, you'll be doing labs and using plenty of different tools. I'm not sure what the exact numbers. It's probably a couple hundred altogether that are part of the overall course. You're not going to use every tool, but you have the choice to. And knowing what the overall process looks like. How do I get data from a system if I need to study it further? What kinds of tools would I use for that? How do I verify that the data I've extracted actually matches the original perfectly? So we have things like, hashing utilities and, methodologies for getting data from a system that's live instead of one that's already been attacked or is shut down. So there's some concepts there to also think about. Our next area is security engineering. And of course, this means trying to design secure solutions that are resilient and resistant to attacks. So how do you keep your configurations of your hardware and your software within the proper parameters to avoid weaknesses that can be easily exploited? So learning about multi-factor authentication, for instance, firmware updates. How does Wi-Fi and Bluetooth work within the security context? Geofencing, geotagging, there's a few other topics that you would be learning about. There's also, for mobile devices, we have to think about the security concerns there. Do you have an environment where you're allowed to bring your own device or choose your own device? Is it a corporate-owned, personally enabled device? There's lots of aspects of maintaining security that would be considered there. And as far as the devices themselves, we have to always be concerned about data theft, people jailbreaking or rooting a device, installing unapproved software, trying to exploit weaknesses in a mobile device. There's lots of different aspects of the attack surface to consider. Each endpoint must have security controls, whether it's something like a phone, as I was just discussing, or it's a laptop or a server. So naturally, hardening means trying to reduce the attack surface, trying to make it more difficult for an attacker to find weaknesses. So we'll learn about things like removing or disabling unneeded services, or changing the hardware configuration in some ways to promote better security, restricting shells, using virtualization. Also, as another aspect of this, we have to think about how to keep systems running well. So they have to be patched, they have to be updated. You're monitoring the logs of that system. Also supporting mandatory control, which means that there's a stricter security policy in place, and there's quite a few hardware-based solutions as well. So things like hardware security module, trusted platform modules, self-encrypting drives. These are all aspects of trustworthy computing. And then the controls that are used for compensation would be things like having antivirus, host-based firewalls, endpoint detection and response, self-healing hardware. These are some of the topics that you'll learn about when you take the CASP course. Other things to think about would be operational technologies. And embedded systems are all around us. Most of you have probably heard of things like Internet of Things or System on a Chip. Perhaps some of you are aware of field programmable gate arrays. There's a few topics in that area. Also, SCADA, which is all around us. This is for industrial control purposes, so there's a lot of concern there as it relates to security for things like power plants, nuclear plants, manufacturing. There's some other protocols to be aware of as well. Some of these are a little bit less common, like Modbus or Zigbee, Common Industrial Protocol. It is a aspect of technology that's not often well known unless people are working in certain industries. And those sectors or those industries would be things like energy, public utilities, manufacturing, healthcare, public services. And so they all have some of their own technology to consider for the overall requirements for protection. Then there's cloud technology. As you can see, there's quite a few topics here. Trying to automate the use of any technology is usually a good idea, but in cloud environments, it's more often used. We also have to think about gathering evidence. So logs are where we look for that. How are they created? How are they monitored? How are they collected if needed? There's also some considerations for lifecycle management. You know, how do you set up an environment? How do you build it and monitor it throughout its useful lifespan? Software-defined networking is another area that's really expanded greatly in recent years. You also need to know a little bit about cloud storage and things like the CASP, the Cloud Access Security Broker. A lot of cloud topics. We saw a mention of PKI a little bit earlier. The public key infrastructure has a large footprint in the IT world today. So you'll need to know about things like certificate authorities, registration authorities, different types of certificates themselves, such as multi-domain, wildcard certificates. Digital signatures are also a topic. Understanding how trust models work in the PKI environment. Digital signature, certificate pinning. There's a few other things here. Signing requests. These are technologies that are quite commonly used, and so we need to understand how that fits together, mostly for secure website access. So, certificate revocation list. Yeah, there's a lot of topics in that area. Then there is encryption. So hashing is not exactly encryption, but it's grouped with it because it provides a security function for integrity protection, right? Encryption is more associated with confidentiality. So we've got that little bit of the connection there. So the different types of algorithms, knowing which ones are which and why they are useful. When is symmetric more desirable than an asymmetric algorithm? What are the reasons for that? You also need to know the different types of algorithms. A little bit about the where and when and how these different encryption choices are made, of course. Other things to think about would be the concept of perfect forward secrecy and key stretching, because these are common requirements when working with crypto systems. And speaking of crypto systems, we have concerns about several topics related to configurations and implementation. You know, how do you revoke a certificate, for instance? What is considered the proper permissions for certificates when they're being used? How do you handle encryption keys? How are they created and distributed? What do you do when a certificate is compromised or a key is compromised? What's the proper process to handle that eventuality? All right, and then the last domain is governance, risk, and compliance, otherwise known as GRC. And we know this was one of the smaller, the smallest domain of the four. So we start off with risk strategies, trying to think about how does the organization measure risk? How do they respond to it? What are the proper ways to determine things like your return on investment or the mean time to recover from a failure? You know, how do you calculate single loss expectancy? How do you calculate the likelihood of the impact of risk or threat events? Handling risk, you can transfer it, you can accept it, you can avoid it, you can mitigate. These are some of the options there. You'll learn about the types of risk, such as residual risk or inherent risk. And of course, managing risk has a life cycle like many other things. We have to first identify it, we assess it or measure it in some way, decide which controls are needed, and apply those controls and think about how that's monitored going forward. tracking risk is an ongoing activity that never really ends. So that there's some interesting topics there as well. Each organization has a tolerance for risk, perhaps even an appetite for it, depending on whether they're a young, growing organization or one that's trying to remain stable for the long term. And then we wrap that section up with policies as they relate to security, such as mandatory vacation and job rotation, separation of duties, least privilege. Hopefully these are some common topics for all of you. So managing and mitigating vendor risk is a big area of concern, especially with things like cloud providers, choosing vendors, making sure that they qualify from a security standpoint to be eligible for use with your organization. Is the vendor going to be there for the long term? What does their viability actually look like? How good is their support? Can they actually meet all of your requirements for supporting your organization, supporting your business, and so on? There's also considerations for the visibility of where you're physically located. How do you protect source code? What are the considerations for dependencies on third parties, such as software code, hardware, and so on? There's a lot of areas to explore there. Then we have compliance frameworks. So what does your organization need to deal with as far as data sovereignty? Who owns the data? How long do you have to keep it? How is it properly destroyed or archived, depending on what your policies require? Where is it physically located? There's a lot of considerations for where data is physically hosted, especially when we think about national boundaries and so on. There's also a little bit on third-party compliance, things like the payment card industry data security standard, or the capability maturity model, Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, General Data Protection Regulation. Hopefully some of these names of legislation will ring a bell. There's also legal considerations, such as e-discovery, legal holds, due diligence, due care, export controls. You also cover contracts, such as service level agreements, non-disclosure agreements, memo of understanding, privacy agreements, and so on. A few other things to think about in governance, risk, and compliance would be dealing with disasters, and how do you maintain the continuity of your business. So a business impact analysis deals with things like recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives, service levels, trying to build a disaster recovery plan. Does your organization need a hot site or a cold site or a warm site? Maybe a mobile site. Naturally, we have to also cover incident response, trying to make sure the organization can handle problems in a short notice and can recover correctly. And then their last topic is testing plans. So building a checklist, for instance, having a walkthrough, going through your tabletop exercises, your interruption testing and parallel testing, to make sure that when disasters truly strike, your organization has done enough preparation through the testing to actually see it through and recover completely. All right, that is a big list of topics. I hope all of you are getting excited about taking a CASP Plus class. It's a lot of material to cover in a 5-day format, but it's a lot of fun as well. And maybe you'll be in one of my classes. It'll be great to have someone that was here at the webinar.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we are going to get to our question answer session in just a moment, but before we do get to that, we are going to take a second and we're going to hear from Tamay, and he is going to tell us about our upcoming the upcoming promotions and webinar related courses. Let me make you the presenter. You should be able to share now. Do you got that, Tanmay?
I think I've got it. Is it
Okay,
visible, Leela?
wonderful. Yes, I can see it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Leela. First up, thank you so much, Dean, that the presentation was very detailed. And thank you so much for coming to our event. Uh, uh, I would like to take you through our offerings because CompTIA is coming up with many updates with the Security Plus, with the Pentest Plus, and CASP Plus CASP one of them. And I'm sure there are many questions around it. So I'd like to take you through our website, that's netcomlearning.com, and you can navigate yourself through the training section and you can choose our vendor, which is CompTIA. Okay, so you can scroll down where here you see CompTIA A plus, again, another popular offering from CompTIA, but we are looking for CSP plus. So we click on cybersecurity and we go to CSP plus. So CS004 is the new update that CompTIA is coming up with. And here you find what you will get with our CSP offering. If you scroll down, you'll also find our next schedules. And as Dean has already mentioned, that hopefully this would be one of his classes, and I'm sure you're going to like it. We do believe that many of you are from teams and have requirements for multiple certifications and training requirements. So you can always fill up this form. And one of our learning consultants are going to come back to you, and we're going to reach out to you for your requirements and we try to understand what you're looking for. That's not all. I would also like to take you through our security page. Again, you can come to training and you can take the courses by practice area, and you go to security. So this page does have all the offerings from cybersecurity space. We have Microsoft, AWS, CompTIA, EC Council, all of these vendors. We are authorized partners with them. And you can click on the nice cybersecurity brochure, which is a framework from US Foundation, NIST, and you can find the perfect security solution for your requirements. You can look for exactly what you're looking for. So I would like you to come to our website and find what you're looking for. And last, I would also take you through our resources section where you'll find our upcoming webinars. So just like this, you're also going to find our security webinars. We have a CND first look. That's a 2.5 hours of masterclass that is coming up. And you can register yourself into these webinars as per your requirement. So a lot of things coming up, and I hopefully would see you guys there. So that's all from me, Leela. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and jump right into our question and answer session. Let me go ahead and take back over those screen presenter rights. We will go ahead and jump right into that question and answer session. First, Tanmay, you'll probably know this. Is there any e-certificates or certificate of participation for today's webinar? And if so, how would they get that?
I'm sorry, Leela, we do not have a certificate for participation for this.
Okay, thank you so much. We have our next question is, what would be your advice to someone who is just beginning, they don't have any training and they're currently changing careers?
I'm assuming that question is for me.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, that
Please
is
do.
to, I think that's to Dean.
Okay, I wasn't, I'm sorry for talking over you. I would say focus on the Security Plus exam first. That's more appropriate for people that are starting out in cybersecurity, and the background requirements are much more lenient compared to something like CASP. This is an advanced certification that you wouldn't try right away. As I pointed out in the beginning, there's a 10-year experience requirement with 5 years in cybersecurity, whereas I think for Security Plus, I think it's only 3 years of cybersecurity experience. So that's what a lot of people start with, and then they work their way up to more advanced certifications.
Yeah, I think I would also want to take this opportunity to ask another question, that like just to lay out a foundation to this. Somebody with no IT experience can always take up CompTIA's A+ before they take up Security Plus. Somebody with let's say with a computer science background can take up Security Plus, no problem. But somebody with no IT experience prior to this can start with A+. That's just my addition.
That's a good point.
Thank you. Thank you. I love having the different perspectives and kind of the different takes on those. Our next question we're going to get to, just trying to check the time real quick, make sure we're on schedule. Okay. We do have time for a few more questions. So if you do have questions, go ahead and get those in, because once we get through them, we will wrap up the session. So our next question we have is, are all the recommended certifications required before taking the exam?
No, they're recommended only because if you try to jump into an advanced certification before doing the other work, it probably won't go very well. So they strongly recommend you go through the foundational certifications and build your level of experience up and your knowledge before attempting an advanced certification such as CASP Plus.
Thank you. And that's an excellent point. I guess they're recommended for a reason.
Right.
So our next question we have is, they're asking, besides or in addition to attending training, what kind of materials are available for studying for the exam?
That's a great question. So CompTIA offers several different pathways to getting certified. Naturally, you're going to want to have the online lab environment, which you get 24/7 access to for 6 months. And I don't know how many labs they've got in the latest version, but it's probably about 25 to 30 hours of labs that you can do at your leisure. It's all online. You do it through a browser. There's also they have learning resources for where you can practice exam questions, and also online. And it's really a good resource for tracking your progress, showing you those areas where you're weak, and letting you use the interface to keep pushing yourself harder to get acceptable results. And then you'll know when you're ready to take the exam based on those tools.
That's a wonderful resource to have. Thank you for sharing. Let's see, it looks like we've got a couple more questions before we do wrap up today. And I think this is a great one, but I do think it varies. How much time do students typically spend preparing for the exam?
That's a tough one to answer. I would say if you meet all of the requirements, you've been in IT for 10 years, you've got 5 years of IT security experience, then I would expect someone who's, it depends on your what's the right word?
Background?
I don't want to use the word enthusiasm, but some people don't have aggressive studying technique. They might want to take their time. So there's a lot of variability there. But if the person who's taking the course does all the labs, or as many of the labs as they can do, they get their hands on those practice questions and really hit that hard until they're getting 80–85% correct, they'll probably need at least a good couple of weeks to prepare. Some people that are not that aggressive, they might like to take a little bit more time. But the people that are ready for the material, 2 weeks is probably enough time.
That's great. Thank you. And it's good to know. I mean, obviously we do have beginners and we have people who have been in this a little longer and are a little more prepared just because of their background. So it's nice to kind of have the spectrum of knowing.
Right.
Excellent question. Let's see. Looks like we've got one more question before we wrap up today. So they're asking, how do the performance-based questions work? I'm assuming this is on the exam.
Right. That is a big concern. And I talked about that just a little bit at the beginning. It's going back to what I said about the materials that CompTIA offers for practicing, they have a interface for the performance-based questions. And you're dragging and dropping things on a diagram, or you're rearranging firewall rules, or you are choosing the correct security controls to put into place on a network diagram. So it's a lot of moving things around with a mouse. You're not really typing for the most part. You've got instructions and some sort of a diagram or some sort of interface, and you've got to manipulate the resources that they give you. And those are challenging for sure. That's why I recommend saving those for the end of the exam. Do all the multiple choice first, and then make sure you've got enough time left over to tackle the performance based, because those are a little bit more difficult than multiple choice questions would be.
Thank you so much. With that, I think we are at the end of the questions we have. So
Okay.
we are going to go ahead and launch a quick poll to find out how many people might be interested in taking some additional training, maybe some training from you. In addition to today's wonderful webinar, we have a lot of informative webinars that are coming up. So please go to www.netcomlearning.com/webinars/ to register for any of those. And thank you all for joining us. If you do come up with any additional questions, you can feel free to send them to us at webinar@netcomlearning.com at any time. And we hope you all found today's webinar to be very informative. We look forward to seeing you back here with us really soon. Also, feel free to tell your friends and colleagues about our webinars and other courses. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Tanmay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, everyone.